Martin Luther King Jr. is typically viewed as probably the most influential civil rights leader in the 20th century. The work he did throughout his life, and what he accomplished, has stood the test of time. We see the influence of his work in legislation even today, and because of what he did we now live in a more socially equal America. Today we see Martin Luther King Jr. as an American hero, but it wasn't always that way, and it still is not that way for civil rights groups. The civil rights movement in America really began to take shape in the 19th century with the abolitionist movement, which was a movement to end and make slavery illegal in the United States. After they succeeded on that front, they moved on to helping to make African Americans more equal in the eyes of the laws. Because of this group, and their supporters, the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment were fought for and eventually passed through Congress. Moving into the 20th century, women's suffrage became a primary focus. A new movement looking for equality of women, giving them the right to vote, better wages, better education, and legal rights. Both of these movements were met with heavy opposition. Attempting to move society from the status quo and into an egalitarian future, but both continued to make progress for the greater good. In the late 1940s, a young preacher from Atlanta, Georgia, named Martin Luther King Jr., began to get himself involved with the civil rights movement. Growing up in the South under Jim Crow laws, Martin experienced discrimination firsthand, and he knew separate but equal was an ideal that was far from the truth. Black schools and facilities were far underfunded compared to their white counterparts, and blacks were still looked down upon and treated as second-class citizens in their own country. King saw these injustices and found a way to combat them. He organized bus boycotts, marches, and sit-ins. He preached using a nonviolent method. He knew retaliating with physical violence would only give the oppressors a reason to strike harder, and that media coverage needed to show that those searching for their rights were doing so as peacefully as possible. On April 4, 1968, King was assassinated outside his hotel in Memphis. 7 days later, the Civil Rights Act of 1968 was passed, stating by force or by threat of force, injure, intimidate, or interfere with anyone, by reason of their race, color, religion, or national origin. His death was not in vain. Today we look at Martin Luther King Jr. as an American hero, but in his time he was seen as a revolutionary. He was seen as an antagonist to the status quo, someone who wanted to change the way things were, someone who wanted to ruin things for white Americans. He was arrested multiple times. He constantly dealt with death threats towards himself and his family. People hated him in his time, yet he continued to persevere for what he believed was right. Now in 2016, the Black Lives Matter movement is a prominent civil rights group. Their main goal is to end the disproportionate amount of police violence against African Americans. After numerous highly publicized incidents of unnecessary lethal force, this group stepped forward in peaceful protest. They've followed the teachings of Martin Luther King, and attempted to have non-violent protests and rallies to bring awareness to these injustices. Still, these people are seen as antagonists of the status quo. People continually look down upon the movement, and attempt to discredit their methods, while simultaneously looking back at Martin Luther King as an American hero. People see the fruits of Dr. King's labor and have no problem looking back on it as a completely positive movement. However, if you ask those same people how they feel about Black Lives Matter, they'd probably say they find them unnecessarily disruptive. They look at the past through rose-colored glasses and don't realize how completely disruptive the civil rights movement was disruptive to American society. With 990 fatal deaths at the hands of police officers, and countless anecdotes about excessive force, I'm sure most Americans can agree that police violence has gotten out of hand. Yet these same people disagree with the method Black Lives Matter attempts to get their point across. Dr. King once said, "First, I must confess that over the last few years I have been gravely disappointed with the white moderate. I have almost reached the regrettable conclusion that the Negro's great stumbling block in the stride toward freedom is not the white citizen's counselor or the Ku Klux Klaner, but the white moderate who is more devoted to order than to justice, who prefers a negative peace which is the absence of tension to a positive peace which is the presence of justice, who constantly says I agree with you in the goal you seek, but I can't agree with your methods of direct action, who paternalistically feels he can set the timetable for another man's freedom, who lives by the myth of time and who constantly advises the Negro to wait until a more convenient season. Shallow understanding from people of goodwill is more frustrating than absolute misunderstanding from people of ill will. Lukewarm acceptance is much more bewildering than outright rejection. King, 1963. As a society, we must realize that with social change comes distress, but with that distress comes progress. We cannot continue to sit back idly and criticize others' methods of attempted progress. If we continue to do that, we will look back and see ourselves on the wrong side of history. Progress must continue to happen, else we are doomed to fall back and repeat the failures of those before us. Martin Luther King Jr. is looked at today as an American hero. I hope we can say the same for other groups looking to make America a better place in future generations.